IVM.
Water by Ralph Waldo Emerson. The water understands civilization well. It wets my foot, but prettily. It chills my life, but wittily. It is not disconcerted. It is not broken-hearted. Well used, it decketh joy. Adorneth, doubleth joy. Ill used, it will destroy. In perfect time and measure, with a face of golden pleasure, elegantly destroy. Welcome to States of Anarchy. I'm your host, Hamsini Hariharan. Every week on the podcast, I talk to experts about global affairs and foreign policy, all in the hope of making a little more sense of the world. In India, we're dependent on the monsoons for our livelihoods, but our lives are also dictated by rivers. And these are not our rivers alone. India has to cooperate with almost all of its territorial neighbors for water. So how can we think about water sharing? What are examples from other parts of the world that we can look to? And what should India's water policy be? My guest for today is Ambika Vishwanath. She is the founder director of the Kuber 9 Initiative, an India-based boutique geopolitical advisory. Ambika is a water security specialist with over 13 years of experience in the field of governance and foreign policy. She has led Track 2 diplomacy efforts and consulted with several governments and international organizations in the MENA region, Europe, and India. She also researches and writes extensively for both national and international publications. We'll get into the conversation with Ambika, but first, a short break.
Hey everybody, welcome to another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you haven't been following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Paytm Money and Intel. Their support is much appreciated. Before I tell you about some of the shows that we have for you this week, I really wanted to really point out the incredible efforts of our host and our team. We've been able to maintain most of our production schedule in this lockdown, which is going into 4 months now. And I couldn't be happier with the fact that our hosts and team have been able to just get all of this stuff out so incredibly well. So I just really wanted to call them out for that and thank them for their support in this time. And since I spent so much time talking about that, and I want to get you out of here quickly, let me give you a quick update on a few shows that you should check out this week. On Siders, we had Amish Tripathi, really interesting discussion, both of them dive deep into history. Monty Panesar was on Edges and Sledges, another really cool show. On Advertising is Dead, Tanmay Bhatt showed up. That was a cool episode. Malini Agarwal, also probably better known as Miss Malini, showed up on Absolutely Right. It's just been an absolutely gangbusters week in terms of the kind of guests we've had and the conversations we've had on the network. Please do check some stuff out. And with that, let's get you back to your show.
Hi, Ambika. Welcome to States of Anarchy. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Hamsini. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so transboundary water study is very niche, even within international relations. And that's one of the many things you study. How did you get into it?
So I didn't study transboundary water, in fact, at all. I studied political science, both in my bachelor's, and I did a master's in Egypt, and then I did a diploma in Turkey. And I studied comparative politics, which I focused on the Middle East. So when I started working in the Middle East, there was a lot of discussion about, at that time, this was in the early 2000s, and we were moving from how land could maybe be used as a space for cooperation, going from conflict to cooperation, and that obviously wasn't working, and it's still not working. And people were starting to look at maybe water as an area of cooperation. And this was in the Middle East. And so it piqued my interest a little bit, and I started looking into the possibilities of that. And that's really how it began. So it was kind of a lucky chance, I guess. I've now been doing this for 15, 16 years. And I'm kind of sad I didn't study this in college, but I don't know if there were that many options also for this kind of study.
Yeah, no, I completely get that. I mean, and the way that IR is changing as a discipline even now, right? Is that right now you have a lot more options than you had 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10.
I am always envious of the new courses that I'm seeing every day that are coming up.
So when you think about water, India is largely dependent on monsoons. And so, acute water shortages are something that we're all familiar with. And I was just thinking about how last year Chennai, which is my hometown, reached day zero, and, all of the water reservoirs around the city had run out. And it makes me really wonder how much of our water issues are dependent on scarcity of water versus mismanagement of water resources by the government, by decision makers, and by people themselves.
It's a bit of both. Mismanagement has more to blame than scarcity, but it's not to say that we don't have a scarcity issue in India. I'll give you a two-part answer here. One, in Peninsular India, which is where we are, I'm assuming you're in Chennai right now at the moment, right? And I'm here in Bombay. We, in this part of the country, are largely dependent on the monsoon. But if you look at northern India along the Himalayan region and then northeast India, while they have very heavy monsoons there as well, all their rivers are perennial. So we're very different in that sense in what's happening in that whole space in environment in India. And then if you look at Western India, they don't have that many rivers. Their groundwater is also less and their monsoon precipitation is less. So very different zones. So it's a scarcity issue, but it's also a management issue. Speaking of Chennai, since I'm from Chennai and as I think you are as well, I'll give you a couple of examples of what's happening there, right? Now, the question here is, how does a city like Chennai, or even if you take Bombay, that is prone to flooding and has very high levels of precipitation, which means we have very heavy monsoons, how do we run out of water once the summer months come? I mean, the answer is really obvious. Most people will say it's because we don't save our water, which is true. We have very, very bad water harvesting practices, both at the city level and at, the household level. And Bangalore, for example, has instituted a law that says, new buildings have to have certain amount of water harvesting, but it's not being followed. So it's the same problems that we have in India with everything. It comes down to water bureaucracy as well. But the question then is, how do we manage this, right? Chennai last year, like you said, had day zero in 2019. But just 3 years before that, in 2015, they were inundated with floods that destroyed so many different parts of the city and the surrounding areas. So 2015, you have these massive floods, very destructive floods. And then 17 and 18, you have low monsoon years, low precipitation years is what we would say. And then in 19, you go dry. What happened to all of that water that Madras received in 2015? Very little of it was saved. Very little of it was able to be saved because of the way the city has developed. So I'll give you two examples over there of what went wrong. One, the mangroves, right? The mangroves in Madras. And I mean, I grew up there, right? In the 80s and the 90s, we had mangroves all across the city. The Kuam River was full of them on either bank, and you could see them. I mean, some would consider them a beautiful species of plant. I'm not necessarily one of those people, but they were really necessary plants to have. Almost, and I try to figure out the exact data for this, and this is another problem we have. But the data tells me that anywhere between 60 to 80% of those mangroves were disappeared because of development activities. Now, those mangroves are really, really important to arrest the water, to arrest flooding. They also help hold water underground, which you can then use when you have dry spells. The other thing that happened was Madras. I'm sorry, I have to say Madras is Chennai now. It really troubles me sometimes, So right. We have this great old tradition of temple tanks, and the base of those temple tanks, the bottoms were all made in such a way that excess water could seep through and be held. A lot of those tanks, because of progress, have been converted into cement bottoms. How are you supposed to allow water to seep through and then store your water? It's like a very well-meaning person decided, okay, we should, modernize. But sometimes modernizing in the wrong direction is not helpful to anybody. So number of different factors, right? And this is not just in Chennai. This is happening here in Bombay also. It's happening in parts of Assam also. I mean, I'm sure you've seen the news of the flooding that's really affecting Assam in a bad way. And this is not just this year, it happens every year in Assam. So how do our cities and our states that receive so much water are also incredibly dry?
Yeah, this is something that I agree with you. Rainwater harvesting became mandatory in Chennai, I think when I was in school about like 10, 15 years ago. And um, and it's very interesting to me that, the rainwater harvesting doesn't really translate because you still flood every year, a couple of months after you say that there's absolutely no water. So I agree with you in that if we did manage not only to conserve but to manage our water much better, then we would possibly just have a better situation.
Yeah, it's mismanagement on the government side, obviously, but there's only so much the government can also do. They have these mandates. They have a lot of states have really good policies and laws but there's a lot of urban apathy. And I mean, I'm focusing a little bit on the urban side of it because the apathy is a little higher, to be honest, in some of these cities. The buildings are flouting these mandates and these policies. These laws are not being followed. So then, I mean, there's only at the end of the day, the government says something needs to be done, but then it's the onus is a little bit on the citizens as well to follow through.
Yeah, I completely agree because, every time when Holi comes around or things come around, you still notice that is like water, right? And I remember like a couple of years ago when the ice bucket challenge or something really took off the best and reached India, a lot of people around me were like, maybe this works when you have no water scarcity, but it's not possibly
No,
the
yeah,
best
please don't get me
trend.
started. I mean, what are we seeing right now, right? This coronavirus. What is our first line of defense for an individual is water. They're saying wash your hands for 20 seconds every time you need to. Now, that's wonderful. But if you're washing your hands for 20 seconds, an average human uses about 1 to 1.5 liters of water when they're washing their hands. Now, the WHO, right in the beginning, put out this video which made me so angry because this video shows how you're supposed to wash your hands, rub your palms and your fingers, and there's a certain way of doing it, and you sing happy birthday some 14 times or something like that. And that video, can you believe it, shows the tap running for those entire 20 seconds. I'm like, what is wrong with you, WHO? And then there's all these celebrities putting out these videos and they're all showing the tap running. And I'm like, what's wrong with you people? People don't have water. How are you wasting? Now, so when you leave that tap running, you're wasting, another like 1 to 2 liters now of water is being used up. How that's, you cannot afford to waste that water, and forget about India and so most of this world, you cannot afford to waste that kind of water. And these celebrities are sitting in California, that's also incredibly water stressed. So these things make me very upset.
And I'm glad that they do. I think it's good to be passionate about the environment and check ourselves and the way we do things. When we talk about water issues, not within the country, but across borders, I was reading up a little bit and I found that India has water issues with almost all of its land neighbors. And that's very interesting because Pakistan would be a little obvious, as is China. But to me, even as someone who was a student of geopolitics, I was wondering why India has so many transboundary water issues.
So I wouldn't use the word issues. I'd rather use the say lack of cooperation, which leads to a number of different kinds of issues. Because to say transboundary issues then signifies we already have some sort of dialogue which hasn't worked. And to be frank, we have barely any dialogue. So, we have not even reached the issue stage in that sense. So I want to sort of look at it a little bit from a macro perspective. You said all of our land borders, and we share rivers with all of our neighboring countries, right? So from the west there's Pakistan, then there's China, there's Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Myanmar. And we don't have, there's no set number. Again, I don't think anyone's been able to calculate, and it's not feasible to calculate, but there are hundreds and hundreds of rivers that we are sharing across our borders, across the spectrum. There are only 5 treaties that India has with her neighbors. So if you think about the ratio of the number of treaties, and then we have less than 30 MOUs, agreements, terms of reference, things that are not considered a treaty, but they are equally important in terms of sharing of information or hydroelectricity or whatever. And now there's so few in terms of engagement and cooperation for hundreds and hundreds of rivers. So that itself is a problem that one has to begin with. Now, I leave Pakistan aside because that's a very special case. India and Pakistan share rivers. We've had the Indus Water Treaty. Everybody sort of highlights it as this amazing treaty that was signed in 1960. And to be sure, in 1960, it was the best treaty that we could have gotten, given the time, given the geopolitics of everything that was happening at that time, and given our foreign policy and given our relationship with Pakistan at that time. The treaty has held steadily through all our wars with Pakistan and all of our skirmishes and everything. So in that sense, yes, one can hail it as a success. But by a treaty, in terms of how you look at it from a water perspective, which is where I'm coming from, it's terrible. It's essentially a divorce agreement. It's like, okay, you take 3 children, I'll take 3 children, and that's it. We're never going to talk about it again. Now, those children have grown up. There are many more demands on those children. What do you do then, right? So it's a very special case over here. Also, it's a special case because it's only 2 countries dealing with it. So in that sense, it should be easier to update that treaty, add a few, updated agreements, annexures to make it reflect the realities of 2020, 2030. But that's unlikely because, here it's India and Pakistan talking to each other, and we don't really do very much of that. So that's happening on one side. So the water issues, they sort of get shrouded in the whole gamut of everything else. So there's that one. Now, on the other side, we have China, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, and India. And collectively, all 5 of us share the entire Ganga, Brahmaputra, Meghna basin, right? It's a large basin, many, many, many big rivers. We have no multilateral institutional mechanism over here on our water. Forget about sharing, equitable or otherwise. There's no multilateral discussion on any level. There's some bilateral, so like India, Bangladesh have the Ganga Water Treaty. India and Nepal have a couple of different treaties. We have one data exchange agreement with China. It's an MOU. It's not even a treaty. So there's all these little things that work and are important, but there's nothing that's looking at the entire basin as a whole. And that is where a lot of our problems are stemming from.
Yeah, I'm sure. And this is fascinating. And it just leads me to the question, why? Why don't we have sort of basin-wide cooperation? Or is it because of sort of the lack of South Asian multilateralism that also gets reflected within the water sector?
So I don't know the answer why, if there is one set answer. If we look at it from different angles, there's probably different answers, and they're probably all very true. One of them you've already said. We have this apathy towards these multilateral organizations in South Asia. I mean, we have your SAARC and now the BBIN and the BIMSTEC, but none of them are very robust, right? If the BBIN, for example, were robust, it could be used as a platform to step into other spaces. And I'll give you an example here of something that's happened. So in Southern Africa, they set up the Southern African Development Cooperation, right? SADC. And that started purely as an economic cooperation zone. They then moved that into working for many, many areas, not only water, but environment, wildlife protection, and various areas of foreign policy now. So it started as one subject, but then because of increasing trust and cooperation and all the important elements of diplomacy, it moved into other spaces. So if we had, starting multilateral institutions in the water space is complicated. It was complicated back in the day, and it's even more complicated now. However, using a different area of cooperation to include these, what is now considered more contentious spaces, is possible. But we don't even have robust institutions in other spaces. And I'm fairly certain a lot of people who are smarter than me in that space would argue that they are now sort of becoming better. And I know some people look to, again, the BBIN or the BIMSTEC maybe as a potential space, but it's not there yet. And unfortunately, when it comes to the water space or the water and environment space, we can't wait for them to be ready. So we need to get there a little bit faster. Also, the another answer to that question is both China and India have shown great reluctance in sort of transboundary water cooperation on a multilateral level. China has a number of treaties and agreements, but they're all bilateral with other neighbors, right? So with Mongolia, Kazakhstan, Russia, but it doesn't want to do it on a multilateral level. It even with the Lower Mekong, for example, it didn't ever join the Lower Mekong River Basin Commission. It sort of created its own new commission where it had a lot more control on that issue. So China's apathy in that sense is well known. India's also shown a certain amount of apathy, which India is a uniquely, where this upper riparian and lower riparian, we have a chance to sort of change that narrative a little bit, do some things a little bit differently. But in this space, we haven't yet done that. And so there's then a lot of the smaller states that are hugely dependent on both China. So if you look at Nepal or Bangladesh for their water, or Nepal and Bhutan, or if you look at Bangladesh vis-a-vis India, haven't sort of come together to create some common cause from their end, which they could. But the kind of cooperation there that you'd require, the kind of push, that the kind of sort of political will that you need to make this happen isn't there. So, there's so many answers to why this hasn't happened, which is when you lay it all out there, then you're like, what is the point now?
Yeah, no, but because it's this complicated is precisely why we haven't had any of these things work out. If it wasn't this complicated, then we'd have easy answers, right? I was just wondering, while you were talking, first, could you explain a little bit about the technical side, maybe, of water sharing? You mentioned upper riparian, lower riparian status. And also, I was wondering, what does water sharing entail? What are the major problems that we have with water sharing?
So upper riparian and lower riparian generally means, for somebody who doesn't understand, if the water flows from me to you, then I'd be the upper riparian and you'd be the lower riparian, which means the river starts in my country and then flows to your country. India is uniquely placed because we're a lower riparian for China, but we're an upper riparian for Bangladesh. Right, so the water is flowing from China into India, into Bangladesh. Some of the tributaries and rivers are flowing through Nepal and Bhutan into India, into Bangladesh. And this is looking only on the Ganga, Brahmaputra, Meghnad basin side of it. So that's, it's very simply put. Water sharing. Now, a lot of people look at water as a resource, which means it's something to be used. It's something to be given, distributed, and used. And this, comes down to a lot of the problems we have within India, internally, and in South Asia, when it comes to how we look at our rivers and lakes and other water bodies, groundwater, is that we are constantly considering it from a supply side perspective. So, which is why I said the Indus Water Treaty, while it makes sense from a foreign policy perspective, doesn't make sense from a science perspective, because you've done an equal division of the rivers over there, not an equitable division. And that really comes down to saying that you haven't considered the life of the river, the life of the water body, the life of the ecology around that river with some amount of foresight. You've just looked at it from that time and place. So most often than not, one always recommends an equitable distribution of water as opposed to an equal distribution. So sharing is not 50% always. Sharing has to be based on a number of different factors, including how much of that river lies in your country, how much of it lies in my country, how much water comes from underground, how much water comes from precipitation, how much water is being used for a variety of different factors. So I'll give you an example here, a little bit far away from Western Africa. So there's the Senegal River Basin over there. And there, I mean, there's a lot of problems over there. But when those four countries that share the Senegal River Basin, I mean, it started with three and then the fourth one joined later on. But when they came together, or all countries coming out of huge amounts of conflict. There was a lot of mistrust. They were, in the 50s and the 60s, it wasn't exactly like a rosy picture back in West Africa. But this is one of the areas they decided that they were going to cooperate on. Everything else be put aside, right? Which is commendable in itself that somebody started this conversation. And what they did, they decided to look at the river basin as a whole unit, not as a sum of parts, which is what we tend to do in South Asia. We tend to do that in parts of Central Asia. In the Middle East, we look at the river as a sum of parts. So you have your Brahmaputra, is part of it is mine. The Yarlung Tsangpo is China's. We're not looking at it as an entire river. And so they looked at it as an entire river, as an entire basin, and then looked at what is the requirement. So in terms of agriculture requirements, in terms of hydroelectricity requirements, and then each country had to make a claim and a case for how much they needed based on their requirements back in the 60s, and then also for the future. And they're constantly updating all of that. So it becomes, not only are you safeguarding the river in that sense, you're also bringing in a little bit of foresight in how you look at your right towards the river and also your responsibility towards the river. So it can't be sharing just 50-50, which is really what we want to do, which is easy, but it's not ideal.
That's very interesting when you think of looking at the river as sort of a living organism. And I was remembering how I think the government a couple of years ago, maybe this was in New Zealand, where it declared that the rivers had life or something.
Few countries have done that. And in fact, there's a discussion in India as well to look at the river as having rights. I don't know if we'll get there yet.
Yeah, I think, before we start deciding that rivers have rights, we need to maybe get to whether people have rights. But that's a discussion for a whole different podcast. You were talking a little bit about the Tsangpo, and I think, when we're in India, we look at China a lot, and I've spoken about this a lot on this podcast as well. But there's often worries about China trying to change the status quo on the border and on other fronts, right? And this is also true with the Tsangpo or the Brahmaputra. There are worries that, China's dam building in parts of Tibet, and this is going to change the way that water flows, not only to India, but to all the other countries that you mentioned. So what is happening, do you know, on the Chinese side of the Tsangpo, and what would that mean for water flows in the Ganga, Brahmaputra, Meghna basin?
So if I knew everything that the Chinese were doing, I would be incredibly famous right now. There's two parts to this question, right? One is, what does dam building actually mean? And what does it mean for the downstream countries, which is the countries that are dependent on these rivers? And so when it comes to dam building, all dams are not for storage. Some dams are only to create hydroelectricity. And unfortunately, we don't always understand the difference, and that's fine. A scientist or an engineer gets this part of it. A policymaker or the media doesn't always look at that nuance, and that nuance is important. So to say that all dam activity in China is going to affect us is not entirely correct. Just to say all dam activity in India is going to affect Bangladesh is also not entirely correct, right? So we have to look at each dam, where they are placed, which river that they are on, and then make a case as to what's going to affect the country that is coming downstream from there. So with that and I think a lot of people don't sort of consider that unfortunately this concept of like, oh, somebody's building a dam and then there's going to be a water shortage and then there's going to be water war is a much more exciting story to write than what might be the real story. So we try, so as people like me who try and sort of bring that nuance in, I've termed myself a translator, which I'm like, I try and translate between what the scientists and the engineers are saying to the policymakers, because these are two groups of people that don't always understand each other. And this is what I did for a few years when I was working in the Middle East, and which is what I'm trying to do here in South Asia as well. And we need a lot more translators in that sense, because these two streams of people are just running in parallel. Never the twain shall meet, I think. And this is not in just in the water space, right? It's probably in the environment space, and it's in a lot of spaces. You see that. And so in terms of the dams in China has sort of given out some information on their activity. India has seen it. Some of it is public. You realize that some of this activity is not going to affect India in terms of quantity. If you just look at the activity on the Tsangpo, which is then the Brahmaputra, we receive more water on the Brahmaputra in India than what flows down from China. So in that sense, quantity is not going to really be affected. And that's very important to keep in mind. However, quality may or may not be affected. When you build a dam and you change the course of the flow of water, and feel free to stop me if I'm getting a little technical here, but it's important that somebody understands that when you change the course of the flow of water, you're not just affecting the quantity. In some cases you are, in some cases you're not. But what you are affecting is the quality of the water that then ultimately flows down, the ecological makeup of that water. And then a number of other things internally in the water system, which are, we don't have to get into, but all of that changes. And that's what then we need to be careful of when you build a dam, whether it is within your country or from, water that's coming down to your country. And there is where we need more study. We don't have that study. We're not doing that. The information is lacking in that space. So I wouldn't say, that all dam activity in China is going to be bad for us. However, we need to be cognizant of the dams that will affect our quality of water coming downstream, and how will that affect the quality of water.
So I'm just wondering, because you said that it changes the quality of water and the ecology, and I understand it changing the ecology of it, but how does the quality of water change? Do you mean that it's in the sense that it's more polluted, or what happens?
It could be more polluted, but that's usually only at the time of construction, right? So that's, in that sense, it's a one-time harm. A lot of countries that build dams do warn of that one-time harm during construction, or when you fill your dam for the first time, you will stop the flow of water, right? But the quality of water could be affected is if you're damming a river, for example, and not again sound like an engineer and have everybody's eyes glaze over. When you build a dam, you are changing the nature of the water, right? Because you're stopping the water from its natural flow. So when you change the nature of the water, fundamentally, the quality of the water will change, because either it doesn't flow as fast as it should, or it's not as slow as it should, right? You change the speed of it, which means the way in which it interacts with your soil and your sediments could change. That's one area in which you change the quality. I'm not saying the quality necessarily changes for the worse, but it will change. And when your quality of water changes, the life that the water was dependent on could also change. I'll put it in a different context. We have this national river linking project in India, which I'm, not in huge favor of at all. Some of the pilot rivers that have been put into to start in central India and MP, if you mix two rivers that have different types of sediment, different types of plant life and aquatic life and fish life and all of that, when you mix them, they don't always mix well. Another type of problem is if your river doesn't flow all the way to the mouth of the river into the sea, which is the case that happened when the Tigris and Euphrates River were flowing down Iraq into the Shatt al-Arab. A lot of water, because of dam activity, weren't coming all the way down to the sea, and you had a lot of seawater seepage happening. It's happening in the Sundarbans as well. Seawater seepage. Now, when you have seawater mixing with fresh water, it changes the nature of your water. So that's how your quality of water changes. I mean, these are different ways in which your quality of water could change. But it's so when you create a dam for storage, or you create a dam for hydroelectric projects, or you create a dam for irrigation purposes, you have to make sure that you aren't completely altering the type of the flow and the quality of the water, quantity aside, which is also an issue, but that gets a lot more attention than this subject gets. Is that clearer?
Yeah, it's much clearer because it's really not something that I would think about. I mean, going back to Chennai, just because I live here, is that the groundwater is often encroached on by the seawater, and that's a major problem. But I didn't realize that there were other ways in which the quality of water
Yeah,
was
I mean,
changed because of
groundwater quality changes simply because of sewage. Also, we dump a lot of sewage into the land, and that changes the quality of the water. But in the case of groundwater in Chennai, there's a seawater seepage because groundwater has been over abstracted so much; it's gone below safe levels, which is then allowing your seawater to flow through. And I mean, then you go into how your soil structure is and your rock structure is underground. And when you dig deeper than you should, you're creating that space essentially for other types of water to flow through and mix with what is essentially very fresh, clean, sweet water. That's how your wells become polluted.
And I'm wondering, when we think about all this is not sort of unique to India in the subcontinent, right? And we spoke about how dam building might not necessarily be, binaries of good or bad, but just mean different things. So a lot of countries also worry about India doing these sort of dam building activities. So do you think also then they could ideally take the approach that India is taking, that to not assume that these activities are for the worst?
Yes, we could. I mean, again, we need to, and I mean, see, there's two countries that are most affected when it comes to activities in India, right? On the one side, you have Pakistan, on the other side, you have Bangladesh. There's been a lot of, and we leave Pakistan aside for a second, but India has very often taken up umbrage with what China is doing with its dams. Sometimes we're doing the same thing vis-a-vis Bangladesh, and Bangladesh has done the same thing with us and taken up issue with our activity. We have been a lot more open in that sense when it comes to our activities. Our relationship with Bangladesh is a lot stronger than China's relationship with us. So in that sense, I think there's a little bit more transparency. I wouldn't say a lot and what it should be, but a little bit more. And so while Bangladesh does take issue with that in that sense, it's not for everything, right? If we were to one day sign this TISTA agreement or a new form of this TISTA agreement, that would really help assuage Bangladesh for a variety of reasons. I think we also need to really look at the entire river basin, the Ganga Meghna river basin over there, and see how we can collaborate with Bangladesh and make that cooperation a lot stronger. It's very weak right now, but it's better than what we have with a lot of the other countries. So again, I wouldn't say all of our activities are bad, but we need to have a lot more information and data as to how these activities might play out in the future. What is the trajectory of our activities? How is it going to affect both internal India and then Bangladesh downstream? On the Pakistan side, I mean, we technically cannot do anything that's outside of our treaty. That would be illegal. And so we have declared that we will use all the water that is allocated to us as per the treaty. Now, if in reality we were to use all of that water, it would take us decades. So that is, I mean, it sounds lovely when you put it out there and when you create that, that excitement that, oh, we're going to use all of this water. But when it comes down to the science of it, it's not that, simple. But we can only do it within the confines of the treaty. However, the treaty needs to be updated. What made sense in 1960 doesn't make sense in 2020 at all, and will not make sense once some of the dams that we are planning to build on the western side come into play. Because the amount of water in that river, the population dependent on the amount of water in that river has all changed. So we need to really take that into account, and not just us. I mean, both India and Pakistan need to take that into account and sort of update some of the figures in that treaty so that we have a much more realistic idea of what is there.
This is, when you put this in context of all of our sort of conflict with Pakistan, and I think, the Indus Water Treaty over the last couple of years has come into the spotlight in that right, because it's sort of one of the main sources for water in Pakistan. And of course, there's anxiety about what it would mean if India were to sort of ever go back on the treaty.
Yeah.
Sorry, that wasn't really a question. It was just something that I was thinking out loud. But do you think that there is a chance that India would possibly go back on the treaty rather than amending it? Or do you think that the way that it reforms the treaty could be one that is less equitable than it is currently?
I don't know. I honestly, I would say I would lean more in the sense on the side of India not sort of ever abrogating the treaty. That I don't think that's likely to happen in a very extreme case. And we've already seen extreme cases, right? We've had an all-out war. So if it didn't, if the treaty didn't break at that time, it's unlikely to break in those cases. Now, if there's an even more extreme case of, I don't know now, World War III and nuclear bombs flying all over the place, then I don't know. I don't think this treaty matters at that point at all then. Because there's going to be nobody left.
Fair enough.
Right? And we shouldn't laugh about it, but that's, so I don't think we are going to do that. And I don't think the Pakistan will do that either. It's unhelpful for both. And there are enough invested parties, third parties that will ensure that we don't reach that stage, that maybe dialogue can sort of salvage it. However, do I think that either country will make the step to update the treaty to reflect a more current reality? I don't think that's also likely to happen, because as it stands, this works for India. And it works for India in terms of saying, we are going to use all the water. And this is what I think one of our ministers said a couple of years ago, saying that we will use all the waters that are there, and everybody clapped and everybody was really excited. And then the Prime Minister also said, blood and water don't mix. And all of this, of course, followed other conflicts that were happening on the border. And this is why we also need to be cognizant of what this means, right? You use all the water allocated to us under the treaty is irresponsible from the science side of it.
That's fair. Ambika, you raised a lot of examples from other parts of the world, in South Africa, in Southern Africa, in the Middle East. What are best practices that we can take from other parts of the world within how water sharing is implemented in India and with our neighbors?
So we've just concluded. India and EU have just had this. I think it was the summit yesterday, right? The 10th summit or 15th summit yesterday, and I was listening to a discussion about that, and somebody said that India tends to look to the EU a lot when it comes to these kinds of issues, climate, environment, and related spaces, energy. And I'd say even in this space, right, on water, transboundary water management, we look to the EU a little bit. So the EU Water Framework Directive is one of the most comprehensive frameworks that was created, and there's a lot to learn from there. We try to implement parts of that when I was working in the Middle East, and rightfully so. A lot of countries in the Middle East say, it's all very well for Europe to implement it. They are at a very different level in their story and in their development stages, right? We need to look at examples also that make sense in terms of parallels of where somebody is in their growth story when it comes to a country or a region. And Europe is at a very different stage. And especially if you look at Western Europe and the rivers that they share there. So we looked at examples from different parts of the world, and Western Senegal, Africa. So the Senegal River Basin Organization is quite an interesting example, because they started this conversation in the 60s when they were all coming out of conflict and colonization. So they were at a very different stage of their growth story, but they started this conversation and continued it till date and are likely to continue. And there is one of the first dams that was built was a dam that was collectively built by all the three countries. This is before the fourth country joined in. So the concept being that responsibility and rights of that dam ownership was collective, which means if a conflict or war were to arise, the likelihood of something happening to that dam is very low, because you're all collectively put money into building it, which means you don't want to really do anything to cause it harm. It sounds very easy and simple. It's not. It took years of negotiation for something like that to happen, and financial assistance from foreign countries to Western Africa. But it's a very interesting concept to study, right? That you have collective ownership and responsibility. So that's an example. And I've seen the dam. I've traveled down the Senegal River, and there's a lot of effort to ensure that river basin organization sort of upholds some of the principles that were discussed back in the 60s. I mean, a lot has changed, some of it not for the better, but there is work to keep that going. I also like to sort of talk about the example of the Lower Mekong Basin, another area where I've traveled down the river quite extensively. And that is because of what they did with data management. India, South Asia, the Himalayan Hindu Kush region is a black hole of data. We have very little data, so this is a problem when it comes to our internal water management and our transboundary water management. There is a lack of data. We really need a lot more studies. Our new Jal Shakti ministry that was set up last year has now realized that this is important and it's required. So they are looking at doing more study on what is the level of our groundwater, what is the level of our surface water, what is reality, right? But that's all internal. When it comes to our shared rivers, there's very little data. And that is something that's really important, because data means you have that knowledge to be able to understand your water body, your river or your lake, or your glaciers in this case also, and then be able to make informed, smart policy. I mean, we talk about the requirement for data, and I hear it all the time when it comes for your energy policy or data for any other policy that we are making, right? And why not for here then? It's still a big, huge empty space. And the Lower Mekong rivers, countries on the Lower Mekong Basin, they put together a very, very comprehensive data management program, which again, I think is worth studying. It's not something that I would, ever recommend that we just lift and implement. The concept is worth studying and then adapting to the Indian context, both internally and in our shared waters. Yeah, these are, because the Europeans are now, okay, their levels of some of these things are very different, right? So when I was working in the Middle East, it was like they were like, oh wait, okay, if West Africa could do it, then that's a story I can understand, I can relate to a little bit easier. And granted, India's growth story now is different. But I think if we look at developing countries that have created some sort of similar mechanisms, then they are a little bit easier to implement, relatable. There's also some very interesting examples in Latin America with the preservation of the Amazon River. Not the forest, which is, apparently they're destroying minute by minute, but on the river, they've done some great preservation and conservation work over there. So lots of good examples and lots of bad examples also that we can learn from, which I'm like, you know what, let's learn from other people's mistakes, if nothing else.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I also agree with the point that you can't just take, frameworks that were suited to other contexts and then
Yeah,
blindly adapt
yeah.
them here. You've spoken a lot about like the need for data. If you were sort of advising the government on a water policy for India, then what would be sort of the basic principles or values that would be behind that strategy
Oh,
for you?
that's a big question. And if you want to do a podcast 2.0, then I'm happy to do that. But I think about this, and I think my people think I'm a little weird because these are things I dream about, and I'd say there are two things. So I want to answer one point we brought up, which I realized I never said anything about, was the right to water, which we were talking about earlier as part of a right to life. Only in 2000 I don't know if you know this, but only in 2000 did the Supreme Court in India recognize right to water as part of right to life. So it's only been 20 years, which, I mean, when I learned this fact, I was like, oh, okay, that seems a bit late, but okay, better late than never. We've had a very disjointed water management policy in India for many years. In the last few years, these things have now gotten better. In 2000, we had the court recognize this, and then in 2005, we finally had our national water policy completely revamped, right? So in the last 15 years, little bits have come together. Then the Niti Aayog in 2017 created this composite water index. And then last year, they put together all of these different ministries and departments and created the Jal Shakti ministry, which is like finally, okay, because otherwise you had water resources on one side, but drinking water on the other side. And these were completely different ministries, which I was like, how did this make sense to anybody back then? But it's been changed, so good. So all of this is good, but what I would do, two things, which I would do like 500 of them, but two very important things, which as you said, principles that I feel like need to be introduced. One, integration, right? We need much more integration in our policy when it comes to water. One, we need to realize water is connected to everything. So you want to have better urban centers, you need to have better urban water management. You cannot talk about having these smart cities without talking about urban water management, right? You cannot talk about having renewable energy and greater energy independence without talking about better water management. So integrate everything into your water management and make sure you have somebody who understands water policies be part of all of these different conversations, because it's very interconnected. So in that sense, I think our policies need to be way more integrated and comprehensive. And the other thing is data. It's data. I mean, that is the thing we have and this is not, I mean, it's not just me saying that it's not happening. The government has recognized this, and that's a good thing, right? First step of solving any problem is saying that you have this problem. So that it's been recognized. The Niti Aayog had brought out a report in 2018, which it said we have a problem with data and we need to rectify it. Now, saying this and actually doing it, as you know, are two very different things. And in India, we are wonderful at saying many things, but not actually doing everything that we say we need to be doing. And so we need to really understand our level of groundwater, where it's at. It's probably a lot worse than we realize. Our surface water, our precipitation levels, and our access. It's all of these things need to be studied in much greater detail, and there needs to be better coordination between the center and the state on this subject. Water, for most things, is a state subject. And so while the center might say, okay, these are some policies that we need to implement, the states have a lot of leeway in how they do it. And I think when it comes to data collection and management, it needs to be much better coordination in between the two. Yeah.
All right. Yeah, I think we have a long way to go with dealing with our water. Thank you so much, Ambika. I'm going to put your resources in the episode description because we're running a little bit out of time.
Oh, thank you.
But thank you so much for joining us and for blowing our minds about
Thanks.
water.
That was fun, and I'm available if anybody has more questions or if they want clarification on anything, and if their eyes didn't glaze over, then I'm most happy.
Cool. I will put your contact information in the episode description so that people can get in touch.
Thanks so much, Hamsini.
That's it for this episode of States of Anarchy. I've attached Ambika's recommendations in the episode description, so don't miss those. You can also follow her on Twitter @IdleThinker. If you have any questions or comments, don't be shy. You can reach out to me at HamsiniH on Twitter or at States of Anarchy on Instagram. We also run weekly quizzes on our Instagram page every Friday, so you can test your knowledge of international relations there. If you enjoy listening to the podcast, I'd love it if you left us a review on whatever podcast app you're using. This will help us reach new people. States of Anarchy is made possible by the good folks at the Takshashila Institution and the Independent Public Spirited and Media Foundation, IPSMF. I hope you're safe and healthy during this difficult time and that you'll tune into the next episode. You can listen to States of Anarchy not only on the IVM podcast app, but also on Spotify, iTunes, Savan, Google Podcasts, or whatever you're using right now. Happy listening.
नमस्ते, मैं हूँ सौरभ चंद्रा
और मैं प्रणय कोटस्ताने।
जब महफिल खत्म होते होते दरवाजे के बाहर पुलिया के ऊपर हम दुनिया भर की जटिल समस्याओं को सॉल्व करने में लग जाते हैं तो हो जाती है पुलियाबाजी।
अब आजकल के अपार्टमेंट वालों ने तो कभी पुलिया देखी नहीं होगी, पर आप फीलिंग तो समझ ही सकते हैं।
तो आइए शामिल हो जाइए हमारी पुलियाबाजी में, जहां प्रणय और मैं एक से एक इंटरेस्टिंग टॉपिक्स की तह तक जाएंगे।
आर्टिफिशियल इंटेलिजेंस, बिटकॉइन, पाकिस्तान, मेडिकल एजुकेशन, करेंसी क्राइसिस, कभी हम दोनों के साथ और अक्सर स्पेशल एक्सपर्ट गेस्ट की कंपनी में।
सुनिए हमें IVM की वेबसाइट, ऐप या अपने फेवरेट पॉडकास्टिंग प्लेटफॉर्म पर हर दूसरे हफ्ते।
Do you wish you were smarter? Well, so do we. But the next best thing?
We could make you sound smarter.
And to help you with this endeavor, we are Simplified, a podcast that attempts to break down the complex world around you with a little knowledge, a lot of poor jokes, and a ton of random trivia.
Episodes out every Monday.
On the IVM podcast app or wherever you get your podcasts.
See ya!